Welcome students, my name is Claus Leggewie from the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities, Kulturwissenschaftliches Institut in Essen, Germany. Lecture 8 on Agents of Transformation will mainly deal with Chapter 2 and 6 of the WBGU report of the Global Change Council, World in Transition, a Social Contract for Sustainability. In episode 1, we will now address the role of values, knowledge and action. And episode 2 will illustrate the importance of change agents in the transformation process. I will give you as well some examples. As usual, we will also have in the third part an interview which will address all open questions. Dear students, what can be learned in this particular episode? First of all, you might have an understanding of the role of values for a transformation towards sustainability. You may be able to distinguish between values, attitudes and opinions. You will become familiar with the theory of value change and the specific term of post-materialism. And you probably will be aware of the acceptance of a low-carbon transformation within the publics of many countries, not just the industrialized world. And you will be aware of the limitations of using gross domestic product, GDP, as an indicator for measuring value, and will learn about alternative measurements of this particular welfare indicator. And finally, you will learn about the gap between attitudes and behavior. So the structure of this episode is that we start with what we are calling change in values, the role of values within the transformation process, quality of life indicators, and the current acceptance of renewable energies in the world. We'll then go over to the so-called GDP debate, and finally we will learn about the gap between attitudes and behavior. Let me start with some general remarks, the position of our topic, values and value change, in the general framework of a great transition or transformation. Transforming economy and society fundamentally, rapidly and on a global scale against people's wishes and prevalent values is neither possible nor desirable. Firstly, an environmental and climate policy that is both effective and democratically legitimate must make people go with the flow. It must make the intended transition agreeable to large majorities, that means acceptance. It must obtain general consent, that is the legitimation of the process, and it must invite their cooperation or civic participation. Secondly, the indispensable social and political mobilization cannot solely rely on a minimization or relinquishment targets, which usually trigger anxiety about the future and what we call loss aversion. It must match perceptions of what a good and successful life is, and these again must be widely shared and attractive. Transformation strategies for averting Earth system crisis should and can put the realization of goals on the daily agenda, goals which a great number of people all over the world strive for anyway, and support decisions which, after balancing all the pros and cons, can be made without regret. That's why we're talking about no regret strategies. Thus I bring forward a twofold argument. A, that the necessary transformation into a low-carbon society already corresponds to some of the prevalent attitudes and value systems in many of the world's countries, as you can see on the slide. And B, that the transformation can therefore be viewed as a positive factor in the sense of increasing subjective life satisfaction for large parts of the population. What are value systems? Well, value systems are always linked to cultural and social context. In pluralistic societies as ours, they are negotiated. That means they are hotly debated against the background of practical problems and dilemmas of everyday life. Value conflicts, and you may wonder about the term conflict, value conflicts are just as normal as distribution conflicts or interest conflicts, and always assuming that they are carried out peacefully and solved amicably, They promote social change and cultural innovation. That is, in a way, a general rule for sociologists. Any kind of reflection on the development, progress and transformation chances of today's societies must start with the empirically proven values and attitudes. This highlights many issues such as what are the value systems in the poor and the wealthy regions of the world and how do they differ? And again, region specific, how is the relationship developing between the goal of increasing material wealth on the one hand and so-called post-materialist ideals of self-expression and consideration of the natural environment on the other? What rank is accorded to the growth of both national economies and the global economy in relation to environmental and climate protection? In my view, a rethinking process seems to be currently taking place in many parts of the world. Just one example from Germany to highlight this. According to a survey published in the autumn of 2010, commissioned by the Bertelsmann Foundation, a significant part of the German population views growth and capitalism with skepticism. A mere third of Germany's citizens believes that growth will automatically impact positively on their own personal quality of life. Immaterial values, such as social justice or environmental protection, are accorded so much importance that they influence the attitude of Germans have towards the economic system. For example, 88% of respondents think that the current system is not suitable for taking environmental protection, resource conservation and social distribution adequately into account. The majority would like a new economic system and does not really believe that the resilience and crisis resistance of purely market-driven economic systems. Particularly younger Germans do not trust the market's self-restorative powers and call for improved compatibility between economic growth and environmental protection. This survey substantiates that in Germany, post-materialist thinking is by no means limited to the well-off and educated. For the majority of respondents, health, social relationships and environmental status were deemed to be far more important sources of personal quality of life than what is called increasing money and wealth. 3/4 of respondents with higher education entrance qualifications and more than 2/3 of respondents with a mere school leaving certificate agreed with the statement, "I consider wealth to be less important than environmental protection and debt reduction." This increasingly skeptical view of the current economic system performance and externalities rests on not least on the realization of the system's social costs that result from economic activities relying on short-term benefits and gains, but also on the improvements of material wealth in low-income household settings, leaving space for alternative post-materialist value orientations and lifestyles. These have emerged from the eco or green niche and, as will be shown in the following, are now increasingly determining general perspectives of the population. This also applies in economically less developed regions. We are not talking about another German Sonderweg here. Let's talk about the terms values, attitudes, and opinions. The terms have very different meanings in different disciplines like psychology, sociology, and political science. But let's look at some general definitions, as you can see on the slide. Personal and cultural values are, according to social anthropologist Claus, values that are shared. He defines values as a shared perception of something worth having or striving for. Cultural values therefore refer to something that has evolved in social culture, something that exists independent of individuals. Personal values, on the other hand, refer to the subjective concept of desire and specific value orientations. Personal and cultural values are, according to social anthropology and cultural anthropology, values and in a sense of shared perception of something worth having or striving for. Cultural values therefore refer to something that has evolved in the social culture, something that exists independent of us as individuals. But personal values, on the other hand, refer to our subjective concepts of desire and a specific value orientation. Attitudes are contrary to the rather abstract concept of values and value systems. They relate to certain objects, like people or groups, like ideas or ideologies, or even specific situations of a society. Attitudes represent, in that sense, evaluation and action tendencies with regard to attitude objects, and are usually stable in the medium term. They are therefore neither long-term value systems nor short-term intentions. And see, the opinions are generally considered to be a kind of verbalization or symbolization of attitudes and values. This has been proposed in a general theory of value change, a theory that is designed to explain the increasing prevalence of post-materialist values since World War II. Ronald Inglehart coined the term silent revolution, and he meant by that the gradual advance of values, mindful of, amongst other aspects, the environment and sustainability. And he explained this in a general theory of value change in the 1970s. If applied, this theory, or this concept, reveals the intergenerational advance of post-materialist values and attitudes, particularly since 1945. In the dichotomy assumed by Inglehart, material needs gratification also includes the pursuit of economic stability and growth, such as price stability, for example, or law and order values, as well as physical needs. All in all, therefore, the striving for physical security. Post-materialist needs, on the other hand, include elements such as self-expression, which are to be found in the gratification of spiritual, creative, and aesthetic needs, and furthermore the desire to participate in state and society, as well as the valuing of freedom of opinions, tolerance, etc. These two value spheres are by no means mutually exclusive, as the international debate on value change has shown. It is much rather a case of their being positioned on a continuum in the direction of a value synthesis, as changing values actually do not develop independently. The change correlates to the post-materialist rising income and education level. Due to the gratification of the material needs and their time budgets, they are able to spend leisure time with partners, family, and friends to dedicate themselves to leisurely enjoyment of arts and culture, for example, and to feel personally accepted and appreciated in these contexts. Initially, this post-Second World War value change in the industrialized societies could only be expressed hypothetically. Inglehart and his group, however, managed to prove the value change theory empirically, supported by regular World Values Surveys data. They argue over the last 25 years that constraints, for example, the existence of or emphasis on normative axioms or practical constraints, have shifted on a global level, and particularly in affluent and secure societies, to the extent of an effective widening of choices that promote the individual's autonomy to act, linked with the respective post-materialist value systems. Interesting with regard to the global transformation process now is the fact that on the basis of these data, this trend cannot just be observed in the rich West, Europe, North America, but also at a different level in other cultural spheres and in emerging countries. This does not necessarily mean that certain material values are disappearing completely from people's value consciousness, of course, or that they have indeed already disappeared. Neither does it mean that they do not continue to determine the actual behavior of individuals and groups. It simply shows that the shift moves on a continuum, and we will come back to this later. Let's look a bit closer to the attitudes to environmental and sustainability issues in various countries and world regions. You can see this on the slide. Engelhardt views the emergence of an increasing power of new social movements like conservation, peace, or gay and lesbian movements as the expression of a wider cultural value change, as we have said. Concern about the natural environment is, just like the valuing of tolerance, an element of a post-materialist attitude pattern that corresponds to the diffusion of self-expression values. The history of the conservation movement in the Western industrialized states has shown that, above all, apart from a value change towards post-materialist attitudes, being directly and perceptibly affected by environmental pollution and damage creates environmental consciousness. Regardless of the exact reasons for the relevant developments, the results of the World Value Surveys document the level of importance that public opinion in many of the world countries today accords to aspects of sustainability. Nowadays, the population views environmental problems, in particularly climate change, as one of the most important political issues. And this is not just true in the comparatively rich northern countries, but also in many of the developing and newly industrializing countries, either from traditional value systems or in respect to the growth of middle classes. Other studies have resulted in figures similar to these World Value Survey results, and they too show that on average a more sustainable lifestyle is not only prevalent in the newly industrializing countries surveyed, which is also explainable by a comparative lower prosperity level and lower resource consumption, but also in countries like South Korea, Mexico, Brazil, or equally in China or India. The sensitivity towards environmental issues is more pronounced than in some of the early industrialized OECD states. With reference to climate change, the results of the Danish Board of Technology's Worldwide Views on Global Warming study, based on a sample of 4,000 respondents from a total of 38 countries, were analogous to World Value Survey results. In all countries and all of the world's regions, a large majority of respondents views global warming as an urgent problem and supports ambitious climate protection measures. As a first conclusion, it should be kept in mind that there is considerable evidence that the protection of the natural environment and sustainability aspects ranks highly in the value systems of large parts of the population in different world regions. Despite its absolute strength and persistence, independent of changing trends, this value change in many of the OECD newly industrializing countries went hand in hand with the formation of green social movements and even political parties. In many countries, departments for the environment have been introduced at state and supranational level, and sustainability issues have a firm place in the cross-functional activities of policymaking and administration. Politicians and civil society actors have been given a broader legitimation basis for ecological policies, which is the most important point. Policies that are purely based on economic performance, on the other hand, clearly appear to have lost their attractiveness and plausibility, even in the corporate world, if you look at corporate social responsibility, conduct codes, and other instruments. And this has now been reflected in a so-called GDP debate as an expression of changing values. This debate on alternatives to gross domestic product, GDP, as a welfare indicator that has currently flared up again, can also be seen as an expression of a described value change. A discussion which initially was led in society's ecological niches has become a matter of concern for governments and the EU Commission. Since 2007, various initiatives for measuring national welfare and social progress have been pioneered by the United Nations, the OECD, the European Community, and Eurostat, the Statistical Survey Office. And most recently, the joint application of all major German parties government parties and opposition parties included, the German Bundestag also established an inquiry commission called Growth, Prosperity, Quality of Life, Options for a Sustainable Economy and Social Progress in the Social Market Economy, whose initiators voiced the opinion that the assessment of human development and subjective life satisfaction ought to be decoupled from growth indicators. And once more, this is not a German Sonderweg. Former French President Sarkozy institutionalized a comparable commission. Both these parliamentary and government initiatives agree that they consider the indicator GDP or GDP per capita as unsuitable for adequately reflecting national welfare, social progress, and aspects of sustainable development. Those who use GDP per capita as a welfare indicator were and are mostly aware of the fact that this indicator can only give at best a very rough estimate of the welfare situation in countries' GDP or GDP per capita. After all, exclusively measure economic market activities and monetary values. The calculation of GDP takes only flow values into account and excludes the existing stocks, meaning that any conclusion regarding the sustainability aspect of these business transactions cannot be drawn. The cost of, for example, remedying environmental damages leads to a higher GDP per capita, even though it only serves the restoration of the status quo. Goods and services that do not have a market price or are not actually traded, such as ecosystem services, housework, voluntary work, or subsistence economic activities, are not included in the GDP. Equally, GDP per capita does not reflect education and health system quality. Only the respective input costs are included. The GDP per capita also makes no statement regarding an economy's income distribution, as a Nobel Prize winner Stiglitz and others have pointed out, although the equality of or inequality of income distribution is considered to be welfare relevant. So, the GDP per capita is neither intended nor suitable for the measuring of welfare or sustainability. This applies to an even greater extent to the measuring of people's subjective well-being. An increase in an economy's performance ability does not necessarily automatically lead to an increase in subjective well-being. A rising GDP per capita does not inevitably lead to rises in individual income. And rising individual incomes, at least at a certain level of material gratification has been achieved, does not increase the subjective well-being further. In the long term, too, there is apparently no clear correlation between rising incomes and subjective happiness. Let me come to a last point, the gap between attitudes and behavior. The conclusion that many people all over the world show a marked sensitivity towards environmental issues and have shown in service that they would be prepared to support a more sustainable economy and way of living, and they accept technological innovations. However, does not mean that a widespread actual rejection of non-sustainable practices has already been taken place or reached, and that concrete environmental policy reforms, such as, for example, the introduction or increase of eco-taxation or the introduction of environmental standards, enjoy the unequivocal approval of all citizens. In the course of such reforms, significant political objections must regularly be overcome, as everybody knows from daily newspapers' reception. And it is certainly not a rare phenomenon that on the one hand people profess support for ambitious climate protection goals in surveys, yet at the same time they also object to paying, for example, higher prices for electricity and fuel from fossil energy carriers. What exactly leads to this gap between attitudes and action that everybody individually knows from her or himself? There are certain barriers preventing value systems from impacting behavior at both individual and social or structural level. An actual change of behavior requires a material and cognitive basis. The suitable socio-economic and legal framework must also be given. Frequently, for example, the intention to use environmentally friendly public transport systems for private journeys and commuting is hampered by a status quo bias, but also by a lack of information, real or supposed disadvantages in terms of cost, both monetary and non-monetary, and wrong fiscal incentives, and, last but not least, a lack of infrastructure. The relatively stable trends towards a rather high level of sensitivity towards environmental issues presented in earlier must therefore not hide the fact that other, sometimes completely contrasting values and framework conditions also partially influence our actual decisions. If you like, this is human behavior. Differing norms and dispositions are not just found in different societies and cultural zones, they also differ according to social class within societies. Studies based on Sinus Institutes or Sinus Social Vision values, representative live world research show that people with certain lifestyles have, so far, shown hardly or no interest in sustainability issues. Conversely, however, the studies also clearly show that there is a significant potential for sustainable behavior in all social groups with a certain ecological affinity, a potential which, moreover, is still a long way from having been fully realized. It is also remarkable in this context that the citizen segment with an ecological affinity has become much more extensive over the past few years. And in addition, the main barriers which make it more difficult for certain individuals or social environments to make sustainable decisions are considered to be the lack of long-term orientation, loss aversion, and past dependencies in general. Let us talk about this lack of long-term orientations and loss aversion. The transformation of societies towards low-carbon economic activity can only succeed if the actors involved, particularly the consumers and voters, take their decisions in such a way that future generations' costs and benefits are also adequately taken into account. Future generations matter. Frequently, such long-term oriented decisions are accompanied by higher costs in the short term than exclusively short-term oriented decisions. This is clear. For example, there is still relatively little demand for energy-efficient household appliances, as these tend to be quite expensive at the point of purchase. And the medium and long term, however, the higher purchasing price is offset by lower running costs. This equally applies to investments in building insulation or the conservation of heating systems, car purchases, and so on. With all of these decisions, the exact tangible value of the future benefit is uncertain and therefore difficult to grasp, unlike the relatively high cost at the point in time when the purchase is made. The fact that many individuals are characterized by loss aversion, particularly in uncertain decision situations, contributes even more to this effect of an overriding awareness of the short-term effects. So in view of the described time architecture of cost and benefits, options which are more expensive in the short term but cheaper in the long run often tend to be left by the wayside. There are many causes for the lack of long-term orientation and or the loss or aversion of individual decision makers. A particularly important role is played by subjective factors like lack of knowledge and uncertainty regarding the pressure to act. The higher the uncertainty is, the more likely it becomes that those deciding will discount future gains, which is why long-term projects are more difficult to realize. Since losses typically have an extremely high level of negative influence on benefit perception, as opposed to the far smaller positive influence of perceived benefit in the cause of gains, consumers will attempt to refrain from actions that they perceive might lead to substantial losses. The later the benefits of an action becomes apparent, And the earlier the costs, the typical distribution of cost and benefit of transformation actions over a period of time, the higher the loss risk is estimated to be, thereby reducing the likelihood that individual actors will welcome and support such action options. In any case, the lower the disposable income or the living standard of those deciding, the more widespread short-term oriented acting and the avoidance of losses are. One method of overcoming those barriers to behavior changes that are the result of a lack of long-term orientation and loss aversion is the employment of so-called nudges. Nudges that are triggers for desired behavior changes are currently the focus of an international discussion on so-called libertarian paternalism strategies. And one of the prominent examples of such nudges are default options, which from a paternalistic perspective stipulate good solutions as a standard, but always include the option of choosing an alternative. It means opt out. When there is a divergence in terms of time between the costs and benefits of an action, nudges can help individuals to make their decisions in such a way that the benefit is optimized in the long term. Are we on the way to a shared global transformation vision already? The diffusion of environmental consciousness and post-materialist values in numerous countries and world regions represents an important precondition for transformation towards sustainability. Persons as well as institutions which act by and large in agreement with the prevalent values carry great strategic weight as so-called change agents or pioneers of change. They bear witness to the fact that a transformation towards sustainability is possible, and that the room to maneuver for reflecting the corresponding values and positions in concrete actions exists in society. In this way, people who share a predisposition towards sustainability, but for whom, with regard to their concrete behavior, other contrary criteria tend to be more significant, could be motivated to support sustainable economic activity and change their own behavior and consumption patterns in these directions, more or less slowly. Then the transformation would not only be down to planetary boundaries, but also backed by the open frontiers of humankind's existence. New alternative ways of living and entrepreneurial visions are constantly being developed and, for example, held up as role models for a good life. These kinds of role models appear to have a solid basis in people's everyday preferences. Self-imposing restrictions to avoid dangerous climate change and other damages to the Earth system is not a new revolutionary idea. People are, as currently proved by the smoking ban, for example, or the idea of balancing budget amendments, quite capable of reducing the degree of their own spontaneous first-tier desires, short-term preferences, in favor of second-tier desires, that is, wish-related desires, and to commit to cooperation to achieve this. They thereby prove a precautionary attitude towards possible preference or the future developments of these preferences. This problematic issue is highlighted in historic transformations whose structural patterns will be the issue of our next episode. Dear students, this was the end of episode number 1. You will have some ideas for self-study. For example, what does post-materialist value change mean and what empirical developments support this theory of value change? What is right or wrong with the GDP indicator? And why does, in particular, the general public support for low-carbon transformation not automatically lead to such a transition? I will give you some literature in the end, and I hope to see you now in episode number 2 on the change agents or the pioneers of transformation.